Welcome to Farcast, the podcast about exploring the most unique fictional worlds to grace the eyes and ears of fantasy and science fiction fans around the world. Today I have a very special episode for you listeners. For one, it's the very first episode, so I think that's pretty special. And later I have an interview with a guest. For another, I will be talking about one of my favorite fictional worlds of all time, from across all forms of media. This particular one is a video game series, and it has reached out into a few other kinds of media as well. There's a novel, which I read, and it is very good. There's also have been a few attempts to make it into a television series, or maybe even a movie some years ago, and Netflix is actually, I've heard they've been attempting to make it into a movie. Hopefully those will come through. Hopefully the adaptation will be good as well, because, sometimes they're not always that good. But as a serious fan of the show, I'd love to see an accurate and well-produced adaptation, such as like The Last of Us on HBO. That came out like a year or so ago. Even though I never played the games, that show was really good. So I suppose I better reveal what the source is, otherwise I'm just talking about nothing, although the title would have already given it away. I am talking about the city of Rapture, which takes place in the video game series BioShock. Particularly BioShock 1, the first game, which came out in 2009, or 2007, sorry. And then the second game, BioShock 2, came out in 2010, that game as well. And the city Rapture is where it takes place, like I said. It also is the setting of the Burial at Sea DLC downloadable contents of the third game, BioShock Infinite. And like I mentioned before, there was a novel which explores the creation of the city itself, which is extremely unique. The book is called BioShock: Rapture by John Shirley. And even though Mr. Shirley didn't have a hand in creating the original world and story of the video games, he does an excellent job at expanding the lore and world building of the series, which is quite the notable feat, considering the original world and story was written and created by the man, the myth, and the legend Ken Levine. I won't go too much into the detail about the creation of Rapture from the book, because it starts from the very beginning of the story, mainly because that would require a lot more time than I have today. Instead, I'll be talking about a few different elements about the city itself and how it's run and its environment, which is very important, where the city is located. My goal is to give the listeners that are completely unfamiliar with BioShock just as much enjoyment as people who do know about BioShock, but might not know about interesting facts that I'll be getting into today and the specific world of BioShock as a whole. That can be discovered beneath the surface of the story, if you'll forgive the pun. The reason that that's a pun is because the city of Rapture is actually located underwater, specifically at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, on the ocean floor between Iceland and Greenland. Now, why the hell would someone build a city on the bottom of the ocean? You're probably asking. Nobody in particular. Well, to answer that, let me give an overview of the history of Rapture, and then I'll get into a quick rundown of the plot of the first game. So, an extremely wealthy Russian immigrant to the United States named Andrew Ryan became sick of the political and social oppression and the potential of mankind. And with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II, that was his final straw. He began a secret project constructing his own city on the bottom of the ocean in November of 1946, and he finished in late 1951. During the construction of the project, he started to invite individuals from around the world who showed promise in the scientific communities, the medical communities, the art the artists and engineers, all sorts of people who had been seemingly oppressed by their own governments in the possibility of their creations. So he wanted to give them an opportunity to come to Rapture where they could explore all the ambitions that they wanted to, that their own previous governments didn't let them. And that was his big goal for the city, and that was the big draw as well, where these people, they wanted to, advance mankind technologically, but they just weren't allowed to. One of these invited scientists was a young female German named Bridget Tenenbaum, and she showed immense promise, and one of her first big discoveries at the city of Rapture itself was a new kind of sea slug, this brand new type of sea slug on the ocean floor that must have been particular to that region. This unique creature is very important because it showed incredible scientific properties, especially in its ability to alter genetic code. Bringing in another great scientist named Yi Suchong, the two of them discovered a way to harvest a material from the slugs that they named Adam, ADAM. This material was used to alter human genetics in ways that have never before been believed or seen or even thought of. And businesses started to spring up that sold like alterations of Adam, which made physical alterations to the body possible through injection. Adam was injected into the body using syringes. And people, like I said, people could use Adam to alter themselves physically. Guys could become more muscular or smarter. Women could get larger breasts, become more attractive. It could be used in like plastic surgery to alter the appearance of people in ways never before thought of. And it was also able to rewrite your genetic code to become more than what you are, and just almost superhuman in a way. And what eventually became known as plasmids were specific genetic tonics that allowed people to control elements like fire, ice, electricity, that sort of thing, and telekinesis as well. And this became super popular for obvious reasons. People were very interested in altering themselves, becoming better, and it also helped them progress their work faster as well. One of these businesses was run by a man named Frank Fontaine, who wasn't invited by Andrew Ryan. However, Frank Fontaine is a masterful con man and businessman who worked his way into Rapture, and because of the explosive business of Adam, and he got into that business, he started to develop like a criminal underbelly in Rapture through smuggling and also just through people and using guns and stuff like that, creating like a criminal society under Ryan's nose. When the demand of Adam became so great that the slugs weren't providing enough Adam to sell to the populace, Bridget Tenenbaum had to think of new ways to create it at a faster rate. Through a series of immoral experimentations, it was found that implanting the slug into the stomach lining of human beings, particularly young girls, probably between the ages of like 6 to 10, 6 to 11, that the amount of Adam produced was greatly increased. And these little girls still had to be living, and they couldn't even be comatose. They had to be, awake and lucid. Even though Tenenbaum, it was hard for her to deal with this, she still went through with it, and the rate at which Adam was produced created an explosion in use of the substance itself. The little girls that had these slugs implanted in their stomach lining became known as little sisters. And even though little was known about Adam, it was still sold at this great rate. And the long-term effects of it were also unknown. Soon it was realized that frequent users of Adam began to showcase grotesque physical and mental disabilities, eventually causing them to go insane and in many cases become violent. And these individuals were nicknamed splicers. Going back to Frank Fontaine, who worked his way into Rapture, like I said, his criminal underworld became to rival Andrew Ryan's hold on the city. And Andrew Ryan began to uncover Frank Fontaine's operations, and then ironically, through Ryan's own power and influence, he took over Fontaine's business, which upset a lot of people, even followers of Ryan, because that was kind of the whole reason that Rapture was created, so that there wouldn't be like oppression and the political influence wouldn't take over people's ambitions. This kind of led to like an uprising and a civil war between the two factions, and violence completely racked the entire city. Splicers were out of control, and regular citizens were rarely safe from the monsters or from the violence between the two men vying for control. But even during this conflict, Adam was still very much in demand, since it was very useful in combat, controlling fire, electricity, ice, stuff like that. And Yi Su-chung, the scientist that worked with Tenenbaum that I mentioned in the past, he discovered that Adam could be harvested and recycled from dead bodies around Rapture, especially dead splicers. But the little sisters were easily targeted by the splicers and harvested for their own Adam that they had collected. So Tenenbaum became horrified by the world that she had a hand in creating and went into hiding. Meanwhile, Su-chung and another scientist named Gilbert Alexander teamed up to create protectors for these little sisters. And these protectors became known as Big Daddies. They were humans, like men, that Alexander and Su-chung experimented on with genetics, and they used the special diving suits that were created to help build Rapture that could withstand the depths of the ocean. They ingrained the bodies of these men into the diving suits themselves and mentally controlled them to take care of the little sisters. And they also mentally conditioned the little sisters to see the world as a beautiful and lovely place rather than bloody and dark and gross. And so they wouldn't care to harvest Adam from dead bodies that they would see all over the place. The Big Daddies and the little sisters would wander Rapture and harvest the Adam from the dead splicers and eliminating intrusive splicers that tried to kill the little sisters themselves. And that basically brings us to where the first game starts. So everything that I've told you is before the first game even begins. Everything, all that information comes from the book, and also just from what you learn playing the first game, just through exploring the city itself. Because in the game, you come across characters that explain what's going on. You come across notes and books and letters and stuff that you can read to learn about the history, learn about all the events that took place, learn about all the science and the world behind it, the environment, everything. And that's just one of the magnificent things about this series, is how Ken Levine was able to just, build this incredibly alive world just out of nothing. Beginning at the first game, I'll just give you a quick plot overview. You play as a man named Jack, who is flying on a plane over the Atlantic Ocean that crash lands at the site of Rapture on the surface of the ocean. On the surface of the water above Rapture, there's a lighthouse that inside is a biosphere, like submarine, submersible, that takes you down to the city itself. And Jack, being the sole survivor of the plane crash, swims right up to the lighthouse, because that's where they crashed, and goes to the city. And when he gets to the city, he gets in contact with a man named Atlas, who stays in contact with Jack through the use of a radio, and basically guides him, or you as the player, through the city of Rapture to free yourself, get back to the surface, and also to free Atlas and free Atlas's family. However, as you will find out later, and this is a spoiler alert, by the way, Atlas is one of the many aliases of the con man Frank Fontaine, who I mentioned a few times earlier, who was fighting against Andrew Ryan and has seemingly won. I say won because the city is basically in complete ruin. Andrew Ryan is still alive, but he's hiding away in his office, and Atlas is just using you, Jack, as the player to get through the city to take out Andrew Ryan and kill him. Now, the major plot driver and the main spoiler of the game, is that Frank Fontaine, in one of his many immoral business partnerships, had actually created Jack, the player, in a lab in Rapture with Suchong, and then smuggled the infant Jack to the surface, where Jack grew up at an accelerated rate due to genetic alterations. And Jack was also implanted with false memories and memory loss, and had no knowledge of Rapture or any of his upbringing or any of the inhabitants of Rapture. And the crash of the plane on the surface of the water above Rapture was no coincidence. It was all orchestrated by Frank Fontaine to get his creation, Jack, to Rapture and control Jack to do his bidding in the city in order to kill Ryan. The way that Frank Fontaine controls you, the player, Jack, is with a mind control phrase known as "would you kindly." So he uses this phrase as Atlas throughout the time that you are talking to him. You don't know what's going on. You don't know that he is Frank Fontaine. But Atlas commonly uses the phrase "would you kindly" to get you to go to places. Because Atlas is seemingly like a friendly man when you're talking to him on the radio, and whenever he says, "would you kindly go do whatever," Jack has to do that because it's in his genetic code because of his creation. The secret gets let out, exposed to you, but you're still under its control, and Atlas eventually guides you to Andrew Ryan's office and suggests to Jack, "would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?" Now, the game has a few different endings, depending on if you, as a player, decide to harvest or save the little sisters that you encounter throughout the game. But the general ending is you end up killing both Ryan and Fontaine, and the rest of the ending depend on, like I said before, whether you save the little sisters that you encounter or you harvest the atom in order to make yourself stronger and make the game easier, I guess. I highly implore you to play the game yourself. The first one is commonly referred to as one of the best video games of all time. The story is amazing, the writing is brilliant, and the world building is highly detailed. Like I mentioned before, all over Rapture there are hints of history and lore to explore, but more than that, each location you can visit inside Rapture, and those you can't, are wonderfully fleshed out. The businesses that exist are each unique and have advertisements that are beautifully displayed in open areas. The art and the style of these advertisements and just of the city itself. It beautifully mimics the classic style of 1950s America, and certain locations also help to explain the fictional possibility of creating a city on the bottom of the ocean, such as a location called Arcadia, which is a giant, rich, and beautiful garden of plants and trees that are used to harvest breathable oxygen for the residents that live there, and so the residents can visit this area to help them cope with living on the bottom of the ocean, and it gives them a taste of the surface. And I would like to leave you with a quote from Andrew Ryan, who uses this slogan as a method to introduce individuals to Rapture, as I now implore you to visit Rapture yourself through the world and the game of BioShock. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, said the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose Rapture. A city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, Rapture can become your city as well. Coming up next is musician and my good friend Hector Trejo to talk about his upcoming existential album.